So tonight I want to talk about a couple of things. First of all, about Altadena, just to set the stage for the larger conversation that I want to pursue with you this evening. For those of you who are interested in the game, I will call out the score periodically. And secondly, there will be a test. They call it trivia. It's a test. So that puts me at ease because as a teacher, that's what we do. I want to start with this photograph of Altadena, California, in part because it's one of the most horrific pictures I've seen out of that particular fire, though it is much like many fires in the United States, particularly in the western part of this country. And one of the things I want you to pay attention to are the embers that you see flying through the air. And you can see almost like contrails, the white streaks going through here as they were doing the time-lapse photography. One of the ways to think about this is that it was an ember fire. The fire came roaring into the city, hit all of those houses, and each house then burned other houses as a process. My way of thinking about this is a little different. It wasn't just embers, because that implies there's wind and then this object that we call an ember. My reading of this is very much like a hurricane. If you've ever gone through one, you know there's wind and you know there's water, but it turns out the wind is water. And in Altadena, the wind was fire. It wasn't just on fire, it was fire. And those folks who lived in this neighborhood that was incinerated within 15 minutes understood that that fire was moving a mile every 6 minutes, which if you think about that, how fast you have to make the decision to get into the car and go. You don't have a moment to think, you've got to fly. And that's also replicated in the Palisades, in Napa in 2017, in the Berkeley Oakland Hills fire of the early 1990s, in Lahaina a year and a half ago, 2 years ago. It's the exact same set of systems. And I want to talk about those systems as a way to get back to a history that I think is at the heart of some of this conversation. So one of the ways, this book came out this past year. It was a pandemic book. I was sitting in my office, bored out of my mind. My students were all over the world. And I'm trying to think, well, what am I going to do? And what am I going to do so that I can teach whatever it is I do in my classroom? And so the book is really drawn out of that as a way to think about how to teach fire using historical documents as a way to get into the conversations that lots of people have had about fire. So I want to use this fire as a way to tell the story, the larger story, in three ways. The first of which is, if we could have the next slide. Climate disruption is real. And one of the ways for those of us who live in Northern California and Southern California, the entire state, including the Eastern Sierra, the way we can see its fingerprints is to go back to 2003 and start calculating how many fires there have been, how deadly they are, and how destructive they may have been. 18 of the most destructive fires have burned since 2003. 19 of the largest fires have burned since 2003, and 13 of the most fatal fires have burned since 2003. And if you really want to dig into the deaths, since 2018 and the Camp Fire, this whole is weighted to the last 7 years. That's an incredible set of statistics from CAL FIRE that I think also tell us something about what climate is doing. It's not the only trigger here, but it is an accelerant. It's like throwing kerosene onto an already burning fire, and it just gets bigger, hotter, faster, and more dangerous. Part of the way to think about climate change, and especially in the West from, say, El Paso west to Los Angeles, and then north up to Denver and across to Vegas, and also, as Coy said, Reno, is they've been drying out. This region, vast region, has been drying out since 1982, 83, 84. So we have a very long, now 40-year history of a slow drying out of a region that frankly was already dry. And until very recently, the EPA had the data up on its website that demonstrated that that drying out is going to go for the rest of this century, if not far beyond that. That big arc is then coupled with smaller droughts. Altadena and Palisades burned during a micro drought that had actually lasted 9 months in Southern California. That was true for the Napa fire in 2017. It was true for lots of fires that have blown up since 2003. There's the big picture, and then there's these smaller moments when these climate disruptive elements emerge. The second thing that is really crucial that I'm going to spend a lot of time talking about is a thing called fire suppression. The way in which the federal government and the state government in California, like other state governments, suppressed fire or tried to suppress fire as a natural force. Beginning in the late 19th and early 20th century, they were articulating that it had to happen. They just didn't have the tools to make it happen. Those tools came in en masse after World War II with bulldozers and airplanes and all sorts of war materiel now starting to be driven towards fighting fire as if it's combat. And the third thing, and this is crucial, it's as true for Reno as it is for Los Angeles, as it is for Lone Pine, that we have built into landscapes that we know burn. CAL FIRE has great maps. They just re-released a new updated map. And you can look at that map and figure out where your house is in relationship to the fire zone and the severity of that fire zone. It's an astonishing sort of graphic image. And then you lay over that where people live within those fire zones. And in Los Angeles, it maps fire zone for fire zone, built environment for built environment. We've paid no attention to the one thing that ends up burning places. And the problem here isn't that fire burns houses. I mean, it's a problem. It's that once burned, we want to build back in a place that has just burned. And politicians will say, got to do it immediately. It's very important. It's absolutely crucial. I get the impulse. It's absolutely the wrong impulse. Because basically what we're doing is building back to burn. So there's a political problem. There is this long-term fire suppression issue that I want to address now. And then there's this larger climatological issue that we're having a very hard time understanding. I think we understand it, or for those who understand it, understand it. It's a very difficult thing to inject it into the civil discourse and then make changes on the basis of that. Heidi, could I have the next slide? Thank you. Okay, so the issue of fire suppression is about 250 years old. It wasn't just the Forest Service that invented this thing, it's actually the Spanish missionaries. As they invade up through Baja California into Alta California, as they called this place, they encountered indigenous peoples, large numbers of them. Probably the most linguistically dense place in the United States in the 1770s was LA, and that's not because the Spanish arrived, it was because of all of the dialects and languages the indigenous people spoke. They were everywhere. They weren't just everywhere, they burned everywhere. Every indigenous tribal entity in California, as in the larger US West, has used fire as a tool to produce material goods, ritual objects, food, cultural meaning, and the like. And they've done it in massive ways. Two signals. The first of which is one of the first entradas, expositions that came into San Diego Bay. They're moored off of the bay, and one of the missionaries writes in his diary, naming San Diego Bay the Bay of Smoke, because it was just billowing. The Kumeyaay and others are just firing like crazy, and it just hung over that bay like smog does today. The second signal has to do with research that the Forest Service has done, trying to estimate in grand landscape scale ways how much fire was actually put on the ground by indigenous people in California. The number they came back with is mind-blowing. Depending on the ecosystem, the desert is its own thing, 4 to 10% of the state was burned annually. 4 to 10%. That's tens of millions of acres over a 10-year period that was burned. And it was burned deliberately, it was burned consciously and intentionally to produce goods. They were using fire the way the missionaries thought they should be using a plow to produce everything that they needed. And so the missionaries have this notion that you got to get fire out of their hands. The only way you're going to convert them to Catholicism and to labor is to take the tool that they use away. And so one of the missionaries that I'm reading through diaries and the like during the pandemic, I nearly jumped out of my seat when I did, that I've highlighted here. Because the argument he makes is the only way we can convert the indigenous people of California is to denaturalize them. Fire made them a natural object. They used nature to produce what they wanted. And so you've got to take the torch out of their hand to denaturalize them. It's an extraordinary articulation that then got followed up politically when the missionaries, through their general council, then prohibited fire that would be suppressed. The people who tried to use fire and those objects that produced that fire would be suppressed so that the missionaries can do the work that they came to Alta California to do. It's an extraordinary combination of an insight that's a strategy and a process that they then unfold. They don't have all of the tools that modern firefighters have, and that's not the point. The point is that was their ambition. 120 years later, it's also the ambition of the US Forest Service. The Forest Service manages roughly 20 million acres in California, about a fifth of the state's population. The Eastern Sierra chock-a-block with national forests, as are all of the mountains in Southern California, as are the Cascades and the coastal mountains along Central California. It's an extraordinary resource. It's a wonderful treasure. Probably 90% of you in this room hike up in the Inyo, whether you know that's what you're doing or not. That's national forest land. They despised fire. And for a logical reason. They believed their job was to produce wood fiber for the economy. If trees burn, you can't get that into the economy. The fascinating thing about that articulation is they knew full well that fire as a natural object was absolutely essential to the regeneration of certain species. And yet they understood that the science had to be set aside for this other economic and political aspiration. Could I have the next slide? So one of the things they do, and I love this funky photograph, is they took a Model A, put railroad wheels on it so that they could use the railroad system, a network of railroads, to move through these national forests to see if they could not use this tool, this car, which is also one of our problems in terms of fighting fire still today, as a way to fight those fires. As Henry Graves, who was the chief in 1920, put it, the Forest Service must oppose with the utmost vigor any system of protection which will wreck these growing forests, a system of protection which we would call prescribed burning, which was also called light burning, and which the agency itself disdained as Paiute forestry, on the assumption that the worst thing you could call a white person is an Indian. So they lambasted white ranchers, miners, and others who used fire to work their forests and produce timber and produce other goods and services that they also wanted to produce on their land. It's not a good look for the Forest Service, I have to say. Could I have the next slide, Heidi? Thank you. The thing that was most striking to me at the beginning of the book that I was starting to make or think about was the degree to which, even at the moment at which the federal agencies were talking about suppressing fire, there were other non-Indigenous people also saying, in response, developing a counter narrative which said, fire is good. We know it is, and we know it because we have watched the indigenous people use it, and we understood why they used it and how they used it. And so Joaquin Miller, who you should never believe because he was one of the great liars of his time, he was a great storyteller, most of which it turns out aren't true. But trust him on this one. I'm kidding, but I do like him in terms of what he says. What he's arguing is that fire should be the servant, not the master of the process. Use fire to fight fire so that you can produce systems, forest systems, that are more resilient. Use fire in grasslands to help regenerate grasslands. Use the tools that are already there rather than to suppress them. Could I have the next slide, please? Joseph Kitts is another one from Northern California. He also worked and owned property in Oregon. Makes the same claim as Joaquin Miller did 30 years earlier. As he says, that India may not have been very scientific from a silviculturalist point of view, from a forester's point of view, but we have to admit that his methods of preservation and natural reproduction are highly successful when compared to our own results. So here's a guy who's very smart, non-indigenous, watches what the indigenous people had done, and said, the metrics by which we judge forestry are flat out wrong. So the scientists are being challenged by people who they would consider non-scientists. But that doesn't mean the language and the arguments are diminished by any means. It just means we've got two different threads of arguments, indigenous and non-indigenous, that argue for the use of fire to maintain the very landscapes that we call home. Could I have the next slide? So this is one of the great finds for me. Digging through Forest Service literature in a funky newsletter that the regional office in California, which was then in San Francisco, it's now in Vallejo, put out. And there was, after a series of really brutal fires in the San Gabriel Mountains, which overlook where I live, and you can see the three plumes here. In a very hot, very dry, heavy wind situation, much as what happened in 2025 or any year between 2024 and 1924. In the midst of this fire, two things happened, one of which is the chief of the US Forest got on the fastest train he could out of DC, came screaming out to Los Angeles, went up onto the fire line, told the fire boss he didn't know what he was doing, and fired him promptly on the site. So very micromanaging. The second of which is that the Mission Federation of Indians in Southern California wrote a letter to President Coolidge and said, effectively, because this is paraphrased through the lens of the Forest Service, that we didn't have fires like this. Why don't you turn this land back to us and we will manage it as our people did for millennia. Forest Service chuckled, said, that's really nice. If you want to join us, please do. But the point is that despite the fact that the Spanish had done really heavy damage to indigenous people, as did westward migration of white settlers and others, there was still the language that fire mattered. And if you just managed the fire better, you wouldn't get a fire like this of 50 to 60,000 acres, which given our million-acre fires seems puny. It's not puny. That's a big fire. So if I could have the next slide. That doesn't stop the Forest Service, and I've got two slides that sort of play out in different ways because it helps us understand that even though they knew the science of fire, their politics and their economics continued to drive them to such a point that in 1935, they published what they called the 10 a.m. rule. And here's the metric. Imagine yourself as a ranger on some national forest somewhere, and you hear from your chief, your boss, that the moment you see smoke, yes, absolutely. The moment you see smoke, it must be extinguished by 10 a.m. the next morning. And if you can't do it, you got to do it on the next 10 a.m. And if you can't get that one, then the third one, the fourth one. I mean, the drive to put it out was making it impossible for you to come up with any other point of view in this process. Could I have the next slide? While all of that's going on, we need to go south in the United States, because in the South, they'd been burning for centuries. Indigenous people, yes, but also non-Indigenous folks. And one of the reasons why is they had a better understanding of oral culture on the one hand and sort of operational understanding on the other, which told them, in this case, that the longleaf pine, one of the central species in the US South along the Gulf Coast, had to have fire or it would disappear. And one of the people, an amateur with air quotes around it, who made this claim in 1888 before a group of people. She was the only woman to speak at this massive North American Conservation Congress in 1888. She got up there and said, you know what? All this stuff about putting out fire isn't going to work in the South. We've been burning all along, and we have to or we lose the most central species. It turns out many of the writers in the South who would later subsequently quote her often were women. So it gets into this very interesting gendered piece of this story, where it's women who are much more savvy about what was going on. And ultimately, if I can have the next slide, men also would begin to figure this out. Herbert Stoddard is one of them in the 1930s, who figured out that if you did not burn southern forest, you would have no quail. They were just going to be ruined, gone as a species. So his goal was to bring back quail, and if you want to bring back quail, you got to use a drip torch. And you have to start burning again. There was another very dramatic piece by S.W. Green, who just leveled the Forest Service in 1933 in an article that, because the editor was so nervous about what he said, he put an editorial counteracting the article before you read it as a reader. He put a second article in front of it so that you had to read that other article before you got to his. And then he had a third one after it so that you heard three versions of anti-article before you actually stopped reading the journal. The point was to shut him down, though they felt they had to publish him. I mean, it's a kind of censorship that is brutally difficult to counteract. But if I could have the next slide. And one of the ways to think about that is from this forester in Montana in 1940. He had spent 40 years fighting fires in Montana. That was his job. And he knew his job was the wrong thing to do. And as he says in this letter to Gifford Pinchot, who was the first chief, of course, I know a fellow probably could get shot if he advocated this, but you know, nature is a pretty wise old girl. And when man tries to improve on it, we generally get things unbalanced. He can't even talk. He can do it in a private correspondence when he's retired, but he can't go public with it because of the sort of reputational issues that came from it. So it isn't just that people didn't know fire was bad. They knew it was good, and they couldn't give voice to that opinion. Could I have the next slide? So the thing about fire, of course, is that it never left the land. It never left indigenous communities in California and much of the West. It may have been underground, but it happened. And one of the fascinating things between 2020 and 2021, which were two brutal fire seasons in California, as you may recall, is the number of indigenous fire managers who wrote op-eds for the LA Times, The Guardian, for local newspapers up in Northern California and elsewhere, every one of which I was reading as they were getting published. And notice, not surprisingly, a couple of central things, one of which is Bill Tripp and the Karuk peoples talks about, we've been doing this for millennia. We have never stopped, despite the prohibitions of using fire, whether Spanish or American. We'll continue to fight for our rights and tribal sovereignty, because the notion was, if you go back to that early missionary, we denaturalize them by taking fire away. By using fire, you are renaturalizing yourself and reclaiming sovereignty. If I got next slide, please. Dawn Blake, who's the Hoopa fire manager in Yurok, she talks again about cultural burns as an essential process by which the two tribes for which she is descended, but also for which she works as a fire manager, have been doing this for a long time. But what's intriguing about Bill Tripp and Dawn Blake and every other one of those writers At some point in the article, they know the audience wants to know, well, how do you know this? And it was either they were taught by their mother or their father, their grandmother or aunt or uncle, and that those generations were taught by some earlier generations, and those earlier generations were taught by others. Oral culture superseded the politics and economic drive of federal agencies, of Spanish missionaries, so that it shouldn't be a surprise, even though it is, that that knowledge was maintained, nurtured like a fire, and would break out at various points when they're able to do so. The striking thing, I think I've got one more, I'm not sure. Yeah, we can end here. The striking thing for me in doing this book and thinking about the way to teach fire is that I got taught by reading these documents. They became the tools of my lesson, or my lesson plan effectively, that led me to this point, and that also led me to begin to think about the long reach of history, which we think of as the past, as if it's gone, and just how sticky it can be, both as Calbeck says, and also as the indigenous writers in the book make clear. The past and the present are the same thing. And what we need to be thinking about is a future in which, as many of them said, we learn to live with fire, not in opposition to it. Thanks very much.